Hi there. In this tutorial I'm going to go through the techniques I used to create this image. So we've got a number of things going on. We've got a landscape outside with a variety of sizes of rocks. We've got some kind of dust or mist in the air, has a variation in it, it's not homogeneous. We've got some texture on the ground here on the floor of the ship, and there's a dirt texture all the way around on all of the metal surfaces. And then there's some lighting in there from various places. I created this at a relatively high resolution, as you can see, so you can actually zoom in quite a bit. And for my Patreon subscribers, I will upload this as a file that you can play with, although some of the textures won't be available because they're downloaded from places like CG Textures, but the basic geometry and so on will be there. So to begin with, let's create the landscape. So we'll just add a simple plane and scale it up. I'm not going to work with real dimensions here, although sometimes that's a good idea. If it's a complete fantasy scene, it's less important unless you're going to put human figures in it. Go into edit mode, right click and say subdivide. And then we'll increase the number of cuts a little, not too much to start with. Right click and say subdivide again. And this time increase the fractal here. And that will start to give you some variation in the landscape. And then subdivide again. And perhaps we'll play around with the fractal once more. And then finally, come out of edit mode and I'll just put a subdivision surface on there just to smooth that out a little bit and set it to shade smooth. If I come up here and turn my camera on, I can see what my camera is going to see, make sure my camera is selected, and I'll just put it about here for the moment. Perhaps make my landscape a little bigger, and you can see you've just got some sort of rolling variations on it there. If you want to, of course, you can select any given vertex. Turn on proportional editing and then just GZ, and we can just raise it up if we want a bit of raised landscape just there. So the next thing we need to do is unwrap. The first thing I'll do is Control A and apply all transforms, and then go into edit mode, make sure all the vertices are selected, press U and just say unwrap. It should be a fairly simple unwrap with such a simple plane. I'm going to open up a new window here and go to the shader editor. Go to materials and say new. And I'll go to material preview here as well, and that's why the landscape's turned white. I'm going to give the plane a name as well, and we'll call that land, and we'll call the material land as well. And I'll come up here, I will add a texture which is an image texture. So I used a little bit of a complicated setup, the texture and materials on the ground, and you'll see why as we go along. So to begin with, I'm just going to open this up, and I've got some textures here, and this is the one I used. Textures.com rocks arid 0014. So CG Textures is where I download a lot of my textures, and we can just put that straight in to the principled shader here, and you can see we've got a basic texture. Now clearly that's fine as far as it goes, but it probably is too big. So I'm opening up a new window and I'll set that one to UV editor, and we'll select the texture. So there it is, and then we're going to edit mode, and you can see, as you'd expect, the whole UV map is covering the whole image texture. So if I now scale this up, you can see the image is getting much smaller, which is good, but there is of course a problem. And the problem is that we've now got these blocks. This is not a tileable texture per se. Now very often you won't see that very much anyway, so it won't really be a problem. But we're going to do something just to reduce the effect of that. So I'm going to add another texture first of all, and I use this one. And if I just plug that one in instead, you can see this is a sort of cracked, baked clay sort of texture, a riverbed sort of texture. And I'm now going to add a color mix node, a mix RGB node. And I'm going to put my other ground texture into the other side of that. So all the way over to one side, we see the rocky texture. All the way over to the other, we see this sort of cracked mud texture. Next thing I'm going to do is add an input, which is a texture coordinate input. And I'm also going to add under vector a mapping node, take the UV out of there and put that into there, and then take the output of that into the vector input on the first texture. Shift D and duplicate that, and we'll replicate what I just did with the other texture, but they've got their own mapping nodes now. So just make a note here, you can see the border of this particular image texture that we've got, and if I switch over to the other one, they happen to be about the same size, so therefore we're getting the border in exactly the same place. So what I then did is I set this top one, the exact value I actually used, and I'll use it again because I'm using the same images, is minus 5.8 for the location on X. I also put minus 3.8 on X rotation and -26 on Y rotation. I then set scale for X, Y and Z to 4. So it's now a different size, it's rotated somewhat, and it's shifted somewhat as well. What I also then did was put some changes into the other side. So I put 12.5 on here. These exact values are up to you. You will just need to really experiment and shift these around to see how this works for you. The main one that will affect it is actually scale and rotation. And I set the scale to 3 for the other one. So now when we switch between them, you can see the other texture is at a completely different angle and it's a different scale. So they'll start to work against each other in terms of those tiles. We obviously need to not just add them together or anything like that. We need to be able to switch between them relatively randomly. So I'm now going to add a texture which is a noise texture. I'll set it to 4D just to give an extra bit of variation. And take the UV output of the texture coordinate into the vector input. This is important because we're connecting all of these textures together to work against the same UV map. I'll then add, under converters, a color ramp, probably one of the most useful nodes there is. Take the factor out into the color ramp, and temporarily I'm just going to take the color ramp output into the principled shader, just so that we can see what's going on. So if we zoom back, you can see we've got a sort of cloud looking texture on there. I'm going to change the interpolation to ease, and then I'm just going to move these pointers on the color ramp toward the middle, which just increases the contrast a bit, something like that. Over here, I'm going to set the scale to 15, put the detail up to 16, and leave everything else at default. We may need to change this. It depends on what it looks like when we use it. So you can see this is the pattern we've created. So I'll put the output of my color mix node back into there, and then take the output of this color ramp into the factor of my color mix node. So this is now controlling which of the textures we're seeing. So although it still has a certain regularity to it, what you can see is now happening is sometimes we're seeing one texture and sometimes we're seeing another. And we can then play around with the scale here to determine an appropriate scale for what we're trying to do. And as you can see from the camera, it's not at all obvious that this is a repeating texture, or that it is repeating as often as it really is. We still need to play around with some of the color in this. So let's put a few more nodes in and make these a little bit more homogeneous. So I use, first of all, let's just move those over there. So I'm going to duplicate this color mix node and just drop it there. On this side, I'm just going to put a slightly yellowish color, as I want this to be the sort of overall cast of the rocks. I'm going to change this to overlay, and I'm going to come over to here and I'm going to go to rendered view in a moment. But before I do that, I'm going to put a simple lamp in the scene. We'll just put a straightforward sun, and that's just to give us a bit of light. And we'll go to rendered view. Perhaps brighten the sun up a little bit. Still a very plain texture. And I'm also going to add a gamma node and just drop that in there. And I had that just to increase slightly, just to overall increase the depth of the color. And then what I did is added another color ramp, set to B-spline this time, take the image output into one side, and then take the output into the factor of that overlay node. And what you can now see that's doing is, for certain parts of the image, this is giving it more color, more of this color. I think I'll just ease that back a little bit. And then what we can do is play around with these points. And I had these sort of out here somewhere. This is an attempt to sort of also tie it together a little bit. You still get some borders like this, and obviously we can play around with things to try and help with those like that. But when we look from the camera, there's pretty much no obvious border there. And if you do see a little place where you've got a hard line, then just adjust the scale very slightly and it'll probably disappear. So that's the basic color of our landscape, but we haven't got much in the way of surface texture yet. So let's add another color ramp and put that there. We'll leave this one on B-spline, and we'll take the output of our second texture into that color ramp. I'm going to add, under vector, a bump node, and we'll take the color output of that color ramp into the height input, and then take the output of that, the normal output, into the normal input over here. And you should be able to see immediately we've got texture appeared, actual what appears to be surface texture. If I take that away, it's very, very smooth. I can even show it better if I take away the color information and now put the normal back in. You can see there is a texture to this landscape. So I'll put the color back in as well. And if you need to, you can vary the strength of it here. So So it's more or less extreme. I actually had it at 1, but what I also did was I was more selective over what parts of this texture contributed to the overall texture. So I brought this down here and took this one closer to the side as well. So that's given our basic rocky landscape. And just to add one final little bit of detail that isn't limited by these UV maps, I've created another noise node. Take the UV output into the normal on that noise node. Not essential, but strictly you should do that. And I'm going to add a converter, which is a math node. Take the factor output and put that into the input of the math node and set the math node to multiply. Leave it on 0.5, or that's what I did to start with anyway. I used a scale of about 750. Detail up at 16. You can actually go higher, but you need to type it in. I had a roughness that I increased slightly from the default to about 0.6 something. And I actually had W at 1. And now if I plug this into displacement, this just adds another little bit of fine detail to the surface. It's a subtle thing, but again, it's extra detail that isn't tied to the UV map border. It will change with height and so on. So it will just give this overall more contiguous landscape. And you can vary the amount of it by changing this value here. So that's our landscape, and we now need to add some rocks to it. So in my previous tutorial, I used the rock generator, and I'm going to do that again this time. So let's put our UV cursor over here somewhere, and then add under mesh a rock generator. Now make sure that's enabled in the add-ons. There's a few things you can play around with in here, but one of the main ones I used was roughness, just to see how that was looking. We've got quite a harsh light at the moment, so I'm going to come over to here so we can just see basic rock form, and we can decide how much detail. So I created several different rock sizes, and the main thing is that we want some rocks that have got a relatively high amount of detail, and those are going to be our large boulders, and then some which have basically the same form but have a lot less detail in them because there's going to be a lot more of them, and those are going to be our intermediate and small size rocks. So this one is going to have a relatively high amount of detail, and you can see now we've just suddenly got a bit of surface variation there. Don't go too mad because we're still going to have a number of these rocks, but you can play around with that. And you notice if you go up to 4 on the detail level, there's a long pause before it resolves. So I'm going to go back down to 3, as that immediately tells you it's created a lot of vertices. And we've already got now almost 1 million vertices, so that's a bit too much. So we'll come back down again to 3, and now we're down to 25,000 vertices. So be careful about that. Don't just use the mouse pointer and swing wildly up, or else you'll be restarting Blender. Once you've got a roughly right looking rock, then we can decide how many. And it's certainly worth having more than one. I would generally suggest somewhere between 4 and 6. You can go for more than that, but obviously you're not going to see every rock. And also, even where you have the same specific rock appearing more than once in the scene, it'll be a different rotation, it'll be maybe up the other way, so it won't look the same. So I'm going to go for half a dozen rocks, and it does create them all on top of each other, but each one will have a slight variation in its parameters. So if we now move them away from each other, there are all our rocks, and some are more rocky than others. So now we need to put a texture on them. So selecting one of the rocks, I'll select new, and we'll call this rock material. So we'll add an image texture, and we'll use the rocks arid texture that I had before. And the next thing we'll do is we'll go into edit mode, make sure all the vertices are selected, press U and unwrap, and then we'll have a look at that. So depending on what it looks like, it may or may not be satisfactory. If there's too much of these sharp lines, you can try a different unwrap method, such as cube projection, for example. You can even fully unwrap it by adding seams and so on if you wish to. Generally speaking, especially with rock textures, you don't need to do that unless you're going to be looking very, very close. But you can see what's going on over here. So if we try sphere projection, you can see what we'll get is some areas that are very stretched, which may or may not be a problem. And then you can just try UV project. And that one's not too bad, and we'll go with that one for the moment. As I said, if you really want to take the time, you can properly UV unwrap it by adding a seam. But bear in mind, when you do that, you are going to have a seam. And so there will be occasions when even that seam is visible. With shapes like this, it's quite difficult to have a completely seam-free unwrap. So next I added, from the color settings, a gamma node, and I just put that up to 1.4. Let's have a look at what that's doing in rendered view. Looks like we've got all our rocks underneath the landscape, so we'll just move those into the light. So there it is. So if I mute that gamma node, you can see it's sort of less intense color than when I have that visible. And the scene is quite well lit, at least initially, so it does tend to wash the colors out a bit. So I'm now going to add the usual color ramp and take the color output into that color ramp. Set it to ease, and I brought the pointers into somewhere around here. I'm now going to add, under converters, a math node, set to multiply, and take the color output into there. Leave the other side at 0.5, and I'll explain what this is doing in a moment. Duplicate the math node. The new copy needs to be an add node. Connect them together, and then the output of that goes into roughness. And again, 0.5 for the second value. So the idea of this is we're homing in on a particular part of the image. So if I plug that straight into here, you can see, because I've narrowed this in, I'm homing in on the very darkest parts of the image, or the lightest parts if you wish. I'm then reducing the difference between the dark and the light elements a bit, by half in fact, but not reintroducing any of the details that I've cut out. And then I'm adding an offset, so that sort of just pushed it all up a bit. So I've reduced it by half and then pushed it up, because the main reason being I want a minimum value for my roughness. I don't want the roughness to go all the way down to 0 and all the way up to 1 necessarily. So I've reduced the range of image here by 50% and then put an offset on it of 50% here. So it varies by less, but gives me about the roughness I want. And I can change these values. And roughness, as you might expect, affect the specular reflections that you get. These values were about what worked for me. So I'm now going to add, under vector, a bump node. Also going to take that color output into the height of that bump node, and then take the output of that into the normal. And you can see instantly we've got texture on the surface. And I'm just going to turn that down a little bit because it's a little bit extreme. So I've used just under 0.3 there. And if you feel you need to, you can invert it, of course. But the default should work fine. I then did this pretty much the same as I did with the landscape. And bearing in mind, the landscape, rocks, and the rocks on that landscape are likely to be related. They're likely to be essentially the same sort of rock. So while you might not want exactly the same texture, it's probably worth having related textures and materials. So I'm going to add a texture which is a noise texture. We'll set it to 4D. I had a W value of 0.4, so this just sort of shifts how that's working, where it is in its noise values. I had a scale of 100, detail at maximum, roughness and distortion at defaults, then add converter, which is a math node, factor out into the input of the math node, and then set that to multiply and take the output into displacement. And then, because it's a bit extreme for an object this size, I set the value to 0.025. So now you can see we've just got a very subtle surface noise, almost like it's a sandstone. So now we'll select, holding shift down, all these other rocks, and then finally select this one, Control L, and say link to materials. We haven't unwrapped these others, of course, so we now just unwrap each one. It's a pity the modifier doesn't do this for us. You can see with these rocks, they seem to change form while you're in edit mode, and that's because the add-on has actually created a cube and then added some modifiers to it to create this randomized shape. So there we go, there's our rocks. And now we'll select each of the rocks again, press M, and just say new collection, and we'll call this large rocks. If we look at these rocks, we can see where all this detail is coming from. So I'm going to Shift D and duplicate all those rocks. I now want some rocks that have got less detail in them. I'm going to move them first of all to a new collection, which is small rocks. You can see them up here. There's my large rocks, there's my small rocks. Then what I'm going to do is take the first one, and we'll leave the displacements on, but we perhaps don't need quite as many displacements. So I'm just minimizing them here so we can see what we've got. So we've got 2 subsurf modifiers on here, so we certainly don't need that. I'm going to take one away. I'm also going to take 2 of these displacements away. You can see we've still got the basic form of the rock, but it's got a lot less vertices now. And I'm also then going to reduce both render and viewport to 2 subdivisions. And you see it's become more blocky now. Make sure it's set to shade smooth. I'm now going to select all the other rocks of the small rocks, then this one, Control L, and this time I'm going to link modifiers. So now they've all got the same set of modifiers. So that's created my rocks. And I now need to create my particle system. So if we go into edit mode, you can see currently the whole thing's selected. So I'm just going to unselect everything. Then while looking through the camera view, I'm going to select mostly vertices within and just outside the camera view. And you may want to go to wireframe so that you can select those that aren't immediately in view of the camera. And you notice I am going slightly outside because I haven't got that many vertices to select. Let's just have a look at what that looks like. And you can see it's this cone that you get. And I'm just going to add a few in just to improve that. I could, of course, add more vertices. And sometimes it's worth doing that. So we'll go with that. Come down to here, Object Data, click plus, and assign a vertex group while you're in edit mode. If I unselect all those, I can now select that, and there it is. And we'll call that group Rocks. So we're now ready to add our particle systems. So we'll add a first one, and we'll call this Big Rocks. For some reason, we still need to name things twice in Blender. We'll set this to pair because these things aren't going to move. They're just going to be stationary, so we don't need all the other properties that come with normal emitter particles. And we'll click Advanced. I only needed about 200 rocks, and we can play around with the seed shortly in order to find a good arrangement that we like. Under Source, I set it to Faces, but I changed it to Random. And I also turned off Even Distribution, because we want it to be genuinely random, or as close to genuinely random as we can get. But an important one is to say use modifiers, because that will then use the additional geometry added by the subdivision surface we put on there to give it more places to put rocks. So let's close that down and then come down to rotation. We'll select rotation, open that up, and we'll select normal for the orientation axis. We'll put randomize up to maximum. We'll put phase up to maximum, and we'll put randomize phase up to maximum. I also did a slight change under velocity, in fact, so everything's left at default except object velocity. I put a random of 0.11 on there. So that just, as you probably saw, the hairs all gained a slight variation in the direction they're pointing. And that'll work with the rotation just to give us some more variation. It's just another bit of random. A lot of particle systems, when you're trying to create naturalistic systems, are all about how you can get various kinds of randomness in there, but with a certain amount of control around it as well. Next, under Render, we need to change that to Collection. Now I'm going to set the default values I used, but the actual values we'll end up with will depend on the overall scale of the scene, and I haven't been very precise in setting that, so we'll see how it goes. But I had a scale of 6 for my rocks, and a scale randomness of about 0.8. If I set that to 1, we'll get really tiny rocks to really big ones, but all of these are supposed to be relatively big rocks, so I don't want that to be at full 1 for the randomness, and even that might be slightly high. So then coming on down, we've set it to collection, so we now need to name the collection, and this is going to be the large rocks. So if we look outside, these may be a little too large. Yes, you can see they're gigantic, but we'll carry on for the moment. We've got object scale ticked. We'll say object rotation, and we'll say pick random. So at this point, let's reduce the scale. Let's try a scale of 1. And you can see how large these rocks are. I can go even smaller with these particular ones. So we'll go for 0.25. That's probably a bit too small, but you're getting the general idea now. So we'll come up to 0.5, maybe even slightly smaller than that, 0.4. And then what we do is obviously we're going to play around with where those rocks are placed. Now at the moment, if we look from above, they're all over the landscape. So if we come down here under vertex groups, we can say for density, use the rocks vertex group. And now you can see there that cone that we defined a little while ago. So that just means we're not rendering rocks where we're not even looking with the camera. Obviously, if you were going to have an animation that moved around this scene, you might want to do it slightly differently. I'm just going to turn off the overlay so that we can see our rocks without that orange outline, and then increase the size of the image. If we come to just the clay view, we can move things around a little more quickly. So there are our rocks. If we come up to here and we play around with the seed, we can try different arrangements. And I think that's actually too many rocks for the size of this scene. So let's drop down to 100. Too many rocks at this size, that is. And then again, play around with the seed until we get an arrangement which we find pleasing. And generally you want to have areas where there aren't very many rocks and areas where there are many. And the fact that they're also impinging on each other isn't too much of a problem with rocks. See, I quite like that one in some ways because it's almost a path leading you through, but it is a bit homogeneous, so we'll carry on. And we'll go with that for now. So we've got a nice boulder up there and then a number there, or maybe we'll just go perhaps there. It's really just getting an interesting landscape. I could even go down to fewer rocks, I think. And I think part of what makes a landscape interesting isn't just what you can see, but what you can't see. So this, for example, something I like about this is that there's some rocks here, occluding much of the landscape behind them, although we can see a little hint that there are things going on back there. Similar thing to what's used in gardening as well. So I think that's not bad. I think we'll go with that for now because we've got some nice close rocks. If we go to rendered view, we can see how that's looking. Obviously, we haven't done anything with the sky yet. So that's not too bad. And we've also got the sun just coming straight down from above right now. So let's modify that. Let's put the overlay back on. We'll select the sun and we'll just put an angle on it. It doesn't really matter where the sun is, but it helps when you're trying to think about it, work out what's going on where. So here we've got the sun somewhat behind the viewer. So let's have a look at what that looks like in rendered view. And now you can see we're getting some shadows, which is helping to give form. So if we go to the sun settings now, I'll give it a slightly yellow color and we can make it slightly larger as well, which gives it a slightly fuzzier shadow. And we can go to the sky, we can say use nodes, and we could use a sky texture, for example, the automated sky texture. Because of what I'm going to do with this, I'm not going to worry about clouds or anything like that, but we can play around with things like turbidity, because that will give you some interesting effects. So we'll go with that sky for the moment, and we'll add another set of rocks. So we haven't got too many of those big rocks, but bear in mind they've got a lot of detail on them. So under particle systems, we'll add a new one. We'll use the big rocks particle settings. We'll click this little 2 and now we can say small rocks. I had about 2,000 of those. You can see they're quite large at the moment. Most of the other settings stay the same, except this time we'll change the collection to small rocks and we'll have a scale that's much smaller than that. So we'll go for 0.1 initially. They're sort of medium-sized rocks really right now. And you can see how that's sort of filling it in. So I quite like that distribution. If we go to material preview mode, you can see them there, but these are using less geometry because of the nature of them. And of course we need to come down here and select the rocks vertex group. And we can even see now that even that might be too many of the smaller or medium sized rocks. So let's try 1200 and maybe come down on the size very slightly, 0.075. Again, you'll have to play around with the scale to find what works for you. And I can even go up slightly on the randomness, scale randomness, and then we'll add another particle system. We'll call this tiny rocks, because obviously if this landscape has been eroding, then it isn't just these big pieces that are going to fall off. You're going to get everything all the way down to sand. Now we're not going to represent the sand other than with the texture and material on the ground, but we can represent something in between the sand and these small rocks. And we'll call this tiny rocks, and we'll use the big rocks 01 settings. We should have renamed that small rocks 1, so we'll do that there. Click this little 2 and then we'll call this one tiny rocks. For my simulation I had an awful lot. I had about 50,000. We'll go for 10,000 at the moment and see how that's looking. We're going to use exactly the same base rocks for this, but you could make even lower poly ones if you wanted to. But obviously what we need to do is to come down on the scale even further. So we'll go with 0.01. And you can see they're little tiny rocks. And we'll go all the way up to 1 on the scale randomness. So we'll have everything from too small to see up to these little tiny fragments here. And now we can afford to have even more of them. But before we do, let's set this density down here. Let's set this vertex group here. And that will increase it because we're limiting where these rocks are, and we'll perhaps go up to 15,000. I wouldn't use children for this as such because it will look a bit too regular, so I would generally just do it directly with the numbers of particles, and then we can obviously play around with the seed. Now if you want to, you can also apply a texture, which is what I did. The idea of this is to have some areas where you haven't actually got these little rocks. So I'm going to say new here and click this little button. Change this to clouds. I changed that then to Voronoi F3. Type was soft and grayscale. I selected a size of 0.65. Again, we may need to change these values. Mapping needs to be UV because we've unwrapped this surface, and UV map, which is the default name for the UV map. You can actually play around with how that maps to the surface here if you want to. Under colors, I turned on color ramp here, and then if you open that up, I'm just going to go to clay view just so that it updates a little more quickly, and then I can pull this up here. And what this is doing, I'll just minimize that, is increasing the contrast on that clouds image up here. and you can see what's happening there. Perhaps even go a little higher up here. So this is now going to define where I have small rocks or tiny rocks or rubble. So now I can come up to here under influence. I'm not interested in general time, that doesn't apply in this case, but I can apply it to density and size. And because of the nature of it, it's not immediately obvious, but you should be able to see when I turn that on and off, not so much on the size, but certainly on the density. There's rocks here, and when I turn this on, some of them have disappeared. So we've got some areas where there are no rocks. And as I said, what we can do is play around with things like the size and the scale. So I could try 0.3, so that's a higher frequency one, or go up to even 1, and it just makes the individual areas bigger. I think something like 0.5 is fine. And it's not that we're looking to see a pattern, it's just that we're looking to see variation. Some areas where there is gravel and some areas where there isn't. And we can then even afford to go back to our particle system and potentially put that up again. So let's go for 35,000 now. So we've still got areas where there are no rocks, but we've also got areas where there are relatively high density of rocks, of tiny rocks. So looking through rendered view, that's basically our landscape. I know there's some mapping issues on some of these rocks, but in actual fact you do actually get rocks that look like that sometimes. But you can play around with that, you can unwrap them differently, rotate the unwrap and so on. But I think that's fine to start with. So we've got our alien landscape, we now need to build our ship. So I'm going to turn off these boxes, which will turn off the rocks from the viewport view. So it's still rendering at the moment, but we're not seeing those rocks anymore, which just makes everything work a little more quickly. We'll go back to clay view for the moment. So I'm going to put my cursor somewhere around there, actually there, and I'm going to add a simple cube and scale it up a bit. I want it around my camera, so we'll put it there, and perhaps scale on the X a little bit. It might need to be a little smaller than that. And then I'm going to select this face without proportional editing on, just move that out to here, and I'm then going to select this face and delete the face. So if I look through the camera now, I just need to close this box up a bit and move it forward slightly so the camera can see it. I just need to move that back face a little further back, and we can play around with parameters for the camera shortly, but that will do to be getting on with. So I'm going to select my camera and my cube and GZ just to move my camera down with the ship as this is. Make sure it's just the camera and the ship that's selected till we can just see the land coming through the ship there, and then just take it up slightly. So we now know the ship is above the landscape, but we're probably going to have issues of particles coming in, and we can sort that out in a little bit. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail of modeling, but I will cover what you really need. So I've got that edge selected. I'm going to press E and then escape and GY just to extend a panel forward like that. So I now have an idea of how far I want that panel to be. So I just need to bring that up slightly so I can now put a slope on that panel. I'm going to go slightly further than that, and it's inside the landscape a little bit, but I can modify now the landscape by just selecting that vertex there and just dropping it down. Clipped off the very corner, it doesn't matter too much, but I can improve that by just dropping those. I don't want it too far below. We're looking from inside the ship, so I don't want too much of a slope on there. At this point, I'm going to add some vertices, so I'm just going to subdivide without fractal on, so set that to 0, and we'll just put a number of additional cuts. We'll go with 5 on this instance. Now notice they're nice squares here, but they're not the same shape back here. Now for what I'm going to do with the texture, I need them to be square back here as well, so I'm just going to add manually, as it were, a few more back here. It doesn't probably matter for the ones back here. So they're closer to square. They're not perfect, but they're more proportional now. So at this point, we'll add a material, and we'll call this base ship material, and we'll just make that a somewhat metallic material and give it a slightly bluey grey look to it for the moment, and similar sort of bluey grey in the viewport, so it's differentiated from other things. I'm then going to add another material. We'll start with ship base, press the 2, and then we will call this grill. So I decided to create the grill procedurally. I'm going to give this first of all a different viewport color so that we can see where we've allocated the grill. So this is really just the idea of something that people would walk on that isn't too slippery. So I'm just adding with Control R some additional loop cuts there, and I'll put some there and there as well. And the reason is so that I can select specific areas and not others. So I'll look from above and B for selection, and I'll select that area and select the grill and assign it there. And then the camera's not going to see all the way back, but nevertheless, I'll go back most of the way and we'll assign the grill material there as well. So those areas are going to be our grill material. Next, I need to unwrap, or I'm going to unwrap. Lots of different ways to do it. Boxes are relatively easy to unwrap, but just to keep things nice and simple, I'm going to select all the faces here. Before I do that, I do need to Control A and say apply all transforms. Sometimes you can get a problem if you've rescaled the shape in some fashion. It's usually not too much of a problem, but you'll get a little warning. And then I'm going to say U unwrap. We have a look at what that's done, and the UV editor, you can see we've got a nice simple unwrap there now, which is fine. I'm going to go to wireframe view, select all of these faces. I'm going to unselect the back faces. This is just a way of unwrapping, and I'll say U unwrap. You can see we've got a nice planar unwrap there, and I don't need to worry about the back face because we're not going to see it. I could remove it, but I'm going to use it to shade any light that might be coming in from the outside world, as we want to control that. So we've got our grill area in view here, so we're ready to make our material now. So we've got a basic material for the ship. I haven't played around with it very much yet, but it's a basic, very clean metallic material. And the grill's the same look at the moment. You can't see any difference. So I'm going to start off by adding a node under textures, which is a wave texture. I'll accept the default of bands, X and sine. I'm going to go with the values I used originally, but I may need to tweak those. So 26 for the scale. Everything else I left at default. Then I'll create a duplicate of that. Again, we may need to change some of the values, but I set this to Y. So this is effectively creating a kind of wave pattern. I set the scale to 75, everything else at default. Then I added a color mix node, take the factor out of each one into the color, and just briefly, we'll look down at our ramp and I'll just take that color straight into the base color for a moment. And you can see we're getting a kind of grid texture. Then added a converter, which is a math node, set that to multiply, and accepted the default of 0.5. This is just to really just be able to control the scale of this texture. And then I added converter, which is a color ramp, set to B-spline, and I flipped the points. So we've got light on the left and dark on the right. Brought the dark pointer down quite a way, and then the light pointer up a bit as well. And now I'm not going to use the color like that. I'll just take that away so it's gone back to the way it was. But I'm going to add under vector a bump node. Put the color into the height, and then the output of the bump node into the normal input on our principled shader. And I turn the strength down to about 0.6. In addition, to sort of give the idea of an element of dirt, what I also did, what I forgot to mention, was change this mix shader to darken, set the factor up at 1. And then you can play around with color ramp in order to get something that looks a bit like a grid. Bearing in mind, you're not really going to be looking straight down at it. You're going to be looking at it from an angle. And obviously you can play around with the scale on these wave textures as well if you want a higher or lower frequency. But it occurred to me that there'd be a certain amount of dirt tracked across this grid. So I also added another texture, which is a noise texture. I added another color ramp, noise texture, left it at 3D, and generally the defaults, took the factor out into that color ramp, but set the dark side of the color ramp to a sort of dusty, orangey, brownish color, not too far from what might have come off the landscape, and then moved the left hand pointer up and the right hand pointer down a bit, and perhaps turn the right hand pointer slightly bluish color and off-white, and then took that into the base color. Blender will generally assume you're using UV input, so it will generally work from a mapping standpoint, but sometimes you do need to put the texture coordinate in there. So you can see we've got sort of some areas where it's the ship-based color and some areas where it isn't, and everything else I left at default. And you can play around with this in order to get more or less dirt effect, and change the scale if you want as well. So now you can see we've just got a little bit of dirt on our floor, but other than that, it's a grid. And perhaps turn that up slightly. So now we'll do a bit of work on the metal of the ship. So we'll go to our ship base material, and first thing I'm going to do is actually add a texture. So I'm going to go up to here, add a texture, image texture, and we'll just connect that straight in for the moment. And you need some sort of dirt type texture. So this is the one I used. You can see it's a sort of cement sort of texture with what's obviously water having been dripping down the texture. And even though this is steel that I'm representing, that'll be quite good to sort of represent oil perhaps that's dripped down. So we can look at either side of our shape because it's got zero thickness, and you can see that's what we're getting. Now there is a little bit of an issue, just got my rocks in the way there. Here we might want to keep that, but on the other hand we might not, because it doesn't really look like metal shapes. So we'll just adjust where the UV map is sitting, and we'll select our dirt texture. So we go into edit mode, and you can see that's where the extra vertices are, and they're right up at that end. So the simplest thing to do might be just to scale X -1, and that's just swapped it round. You also notice, however, that the drips seem to be going the wrong way up, particularly on the side, which is most important. So I'm also going to now scale Y -1. I'm going to scale it down a little bit, and then I can move it around as well. And we're going to be playing around with this a bit yet. It's not trying to get a massive amount of the drips on there. Perhaps we'll scale on the Y just to increase it in that direction. And one thing worth noting is this map is the whole surface, and I don't actually want that. Rather than the automatic unwrapping that I did, what I'm going to do is select all of these faces and go around here, select all of these faces and that one. Look from one side, make sure I'm in orthographic, and then say U, project from view bounds. And now you can see those drips are behaving more as you'd expect them to. We've obviously got the ones on the top as well, and I think what I'll do with those is I'll just rotate them. It somehow seems to be more sensible to have any sort of streaks going in that direction on the ceiling rather than across the ceiling, in this application at least. So that's got our basic drips and noise. So now we need to build up a bit more complexity to the material. This is closest to the camera, so we need to put a bit more effort into this. So let's go to rendered view. And in fact, before I go any further, I'm going to add another light into the scene. So just for the time being, I'm just going to add a plane, scale it down a bit, scale on the X, and then scale it down a bit more, I think, perhaps a little more. And then I'm just going to go into edit mode, press I, which inserts. And because of the aspect of the shape, I've got bigger gaps here. So I'm going to now scale on X just to even that up. Now coming round, GZ, just to give me a sort of shape to the light, because we're using cycles for this, so we can use meshes as lights. And we're saying new, but we don't want the principled shader. We want to add an emission shader, and we'll just drop that in there. And we'll try a strength of 3 for the moment, and perhaps give that a very slight blue cast. So we'll move that over to here and just position it roughly where we want it to be. If we have a look in our scene now in rendered view, we can try even brighter. You can see we're now getting a bit of extra light, which is helping us to see this material a little better. And what I actually did as well, go to clay view for a moment, is I added a point light as well behind the camera effectively, although it's not visible in the scene anyway, just to really add a bit more light into the scene inside the ship. So if I set that to off, we're not seeing a great deal from it at the moment there. So perhaps somewhere slightly less than that. We'll put that at 50 for the moment. So now we can see a lot more of the inside of our ship, and we can do some more work on the material. So I'm just going to come to one part where we can see reasonably well some of this material. So all we've got is this sort of concrete texture on there at the moment, but we've got a metallic on there as well, which is obviously giving it more of a metal sheen. So I'm going to add converter, which is a color ramp, and drop that in there. And now I can use this to improve the contrast on this dirt texture. And there you can see we've got a lot more going on there now. I haven't properly set the UV map's position relative to the texture down here, but it probably doesn't matter too much. And the fact that it's identical one side to the other, obviously you can fix that by just moving one of the UV maps around. I think I'll do that now just to show you, because it's so obvious. I'll rescale it slightly and perhaps just move it off a bit. This is where it's better not to use the whole texture, and then you can move things around more easily. And generally I wouldn't want to run the end off like that. So I just flipped it round as well. And now if we look through, you can see we've got very different textures one side to the other. Quite like the fact that it's much darker down the bottom, but we're going to do something to add an element of that anyway, regardless of whether there's any of that in the texture. So now we're going to add color mix node. We're going to drop that in there. I'm going to set that to multiply, give ourselves a bit more space here. and we're going to put the color ramp into the factor, and then we'll have sort of light, slightly bluey color on the one side and dark, slightly brown, sort of rusty color on the other. So effectively what this is doing is turning our dirt into the switch between our steel color and our rusty color. If it's the wrong way up, we can just flip the color ramp here. So I've just flipped the color ramp just to get the texture the right way around, and there we go. So continuing on, we'll make a copy of that color mix node and we'll drop that there. I have this set to 1 at the moment, and darken. I'm going to make a copy of the color ramp now, just put that down here. And again, I'm going to use my rusty color and my sort of light steel color, just drag those over there. And the output of that color ramp goes into the other side of that darken node. And the reason for this is I'm also going to add now a new node, which is the geometry node. And if we look on one on there, we have this output called pointiness. And if we connect that into there and then play around with these values, what we can do is effectively, wherever there's sharp corners, we can produce an effect which gives us the impression that dirt has accumulated in those corners. So if I take out the noise from one side, which is obviously adding quite a bit of this anyway, and then we start to use this, you can see in the very corners there, it's darkening it. But it does it in a very even way. Obviously we could mix noise in with that as well. But because I've got the text here, I don't really need to do that. It's got noise on it already. So I can just drop that down into there. And now I've got the combination of both. So it's just making sure that it's nice and dark in these sharp corners, as you'd expect it to be, accumulating dust and dirt. So I'm now going to add a converter, which is a math node. Set that to multiply. Have the lower value at about 0.6. Take the output of my color ramp and put that into here. And I'm going to duplicate that math node, change that to add, and I used a value about 0.3, and take the output and multiply into there. And then the output of that goes into roughness. So the idea being that certain parts of the material are a little bit shiny and other parts aren't. And again, I'm scaling it with this one and then putting an offset with this one. So if I increase that offset, the roughness will go up and it becomes much flatter, as it were. If I reduce this, if I set this to 0, for example, now you can see it's almost a mirror in certain places, which is probably a bit too much. We're not seeing through it, we're actually seeing reflection. So I'm just going to increase that a little bit, which gives us a bit more roughness. 0.3 is what I used. I think I'll go with 0.2 this time. So we can see a little bit of the color of the landscape reflected out there, but not too much, but very little of these grimy bits. Now, if that's a bit too extreme, we can obviously ease that off by taking that out to here. So just moving this little slider, and that's reduced the effect of the dirt slightly. And I'm just scaling it back a bit because I changed that. I'll go with 0.15 now. So that's that. That's the basic material for the ship. And now we need to put some pipes and things like that, things of interest in there. So I'm going to put my cursor over here so we can see what we're doing more easily, and we'll look from above. I'm going to add simple cylinder to begin with. We'll rotate X90, and I'm going to just take these end faces off. You can actually select not to have end caps when you create it. You just got to remember to do that. Strictly, I don't want to have too many vertices because I'm going to have quite a lot of these little cylinders, as you'll see, but it doesn't matter too much for this example. I'm going to make it a little smaller, and then I'll give it some geometry just to make it a bit more interesting. Set it to shade smooth, perhaps scale on the Y just to shorten it a little bit, and just rounding it out slightly. So that's a base shape, and we'll give that a name. We'll call it pipe section. And for materials, we'll just give it the base ship material for the moment and apply all transforms. Next, I'm going to add a curve. We'll just make it a Bezier curve. This doesn't exactly what you do with this shape is entirely up to you. I'm just going to add a few extra sections. Make sure that the origin is at the geometry. With the pipe section selected, we'll add modifiers and we will create an array. And we'll go for 0 on X and 1 on Y. We'll do a few more. Then we need to add another modifier, curve modifier, and select the Bezier curve. And what you can see is as we move it around, once I've set it to Y, which is the direction this goes in, that it starts to follow that curve. And I'm going to make it a little smaller. and then we can go back to our array and we can start to increase it. And there you go. We've now got an interesting little pipe section. You can leave it like that, but you'll need to keep curve and the mesh in line. Otherwise, as you can see, if you move either of them around, it moves around. But the other option is just to apply the array and then apply the curve. And now you've got an object you can move around. So I'm going to rotate Y90, and then I'll put that up here somewhere. Probably need to scale down a bit. Perhaps even smaller than that. So I put it something like that. You can also add perhaps a small cylinder, add a little bevel to the top, set it to shade smooth, take away the face at the bottom, rotate Y90 and GX. And I used that just to cover the ends of the pipes. And if you do Alt D, if you make any modifications to one, you can see it's going to affect both of them, which can be handy if you want them all to be the same. And we'll select the ship base material. Now I did actually set a slightly different material, so you could just click this little 3 here and create perhaps base ship 2 material, and I would have increased the metallic, and we probably don't need this element of it here, so I'm going to just delete this string and perhaps just feed that into the roughness value just to really give it a slightly different color. And I've just flipped the color ramp there just to make some further changes. And then what I might want to do is select that same material for the tube as well. So if I turn off the overlay, you can now see what we're getting there. I did put a couple of struts either side for my ship, but I won't go into that now. That's really just a couple of cylinders. But we'll call the particles back now so that we can see them in the preview, at least the big particles, and we can get a better idea of what's going on. And what we'll do is a quick preview render now. So we've got a few more things to do. You can see we've got some rock coming through under here, so we probably need to take away some of the particle systems under here. In my main render, I also had a bit of extra geometry around the edge here and had a little panel with some switches on. Essentially, the glowing switches are exactly the same as this light. It's just adding an emission shader and then setting the brightness however you want it. But the last thing we need to do, other than adjusting these particles, is just put on the dust or mist that's in the air, and then adjust the compositing. You can see we've got some large particles appearing under here. So if we go to edit mode and go to our vertex groups and say select, you can see we've got vertices that are underneath the box containing our camera that are enabled for particles. So let's just select this area and just say remove. And now if we say select, you can see we haven't got any there. And we've no longer got any stones coming out through the bottom of the ship. So now we'll add another cube and make it quite large. It doesn't need to be too tall, but it does need to enclose at least the view of the camera. It doesn't really need to go much below the surface, just far enough that it's not showing. So there you can see it's all enclosed within the mist now. Probably don't need the mist inside the ship, so I ended up just moving it to just coincide with the entrance of the ship, which is sort of logical, especially if it's dust being blown in a wind. So it's a fairly straightforward material for this. It's obviously going to be another volumetric material, and I'll go to material preview because it'll give you a general idea of what it's looking like. Obviously it's just solid at the moment, and we'll say new for materials, but we don't want principled surface shader, we want a volumetric shader. So I've removed that, and I'm now going to add shader, which is the principled volume shader, and I'll connect that into volume. And you can see we've now got some instant deep foggy mist. Color I set to a sort of orangey color, quite a strong orangey color, relatively light, but a good strong color to it. Now I'm going to add an input which is texture coordinate, and I did this so that I could get a better control over the noise that I'm going to add to this scene. You can try it without, but you'll probably find you need to add it. I'm now going to add the usual, another favorite node, which is the noise texture, set to 4D, which gives you some more variation, and we'll take the generated output of the texture coordinate and put that into there. I used a W value of about 22 and a scale of 30. I think the W is, as it were, another dimension. That's the fourth dimension, time I guess it would be, that adds variation into the noise. Detail up at 16. Roughness we can play with. I left it slightly below the default, but distortion I put up at 3.5. Distortion helps to add an effect that's a bit like swirls into the noise, And for something like this that's taking place in an atmosphere, that's obviously something we want. Then I added a math node, take the factor output and put that into there. I set that to 0.175. Again, we may need to change this in a moment, and multiply. And then the other favorite node, of course, is the color ramp. Take the output from that multiplier node into there. I kept it on linear for the time being. Bring the low end up slightly and the high end down quite a way. They're fairly close together. And then finally connect that into density. So you can see, at least in the preview, it's all vanished completely. So we can try playing around with the color ramp, see if this brings anything back. And you can see we probably had the low end a bit too high. And I bring the upper end down, and you can see we're getting some noise there now, or some variation in the mist. So we can play around with the scale, and I'm going to go down on the scale now. This is only the preview, so I'm really just using this to get a feel for the scale. You can't really tell what it's going to look like until you go into the preview render mode. So try that and then go to rendered view. You can see that's quite a bit different, quite a bit denser in fact. But what we can also see is there's variation. We can see a bit of sky back there. So if I reduce this value to 0.15, for example, you can see the whole thing becomes a lot less dense. So that's sort of a quick way to play with density without changing too much else. That's probably not dense enough, so we'll try 0.16. And of course, the overall amount of light in the scene falls because it's being absorbed and scattered by this mist, as it would in real life. That's getting pretty close to what I would want. You can play around with this, of course. By bringing these 2 points closer together, you'll have a greater variation between where there is no volumetric mist and where there is a lot of it. So you effectively increase the contrast. And of course, you can play around with these values as well. You might even want to go up on the distortion a little bit here. So the idea is that this is sort of dirt and fog and what have you being blown across the scene, perhaps sand even. So one of the things with cycles is noise. We always have to deal with that, but to really assess that, we need to make a quick render. We'll obviously have noise here because I'm not rendering at very many samples. Viewport's at 32. So I'm going to actually drop that. I'm going to have the viewport at 24, and I'm going to have the main render at only 60 samples, just to speed it up a bit. I'm making the viewport redraw there, and we'll zoom in a little bit so we can see the noise slightly better. We'll render it in a moment and then work on reducing that noise, because that also reduces the visibility of detail. And because this is a still image we're creating, we can be a bit more aggressive in the noise removal. One of the things that's worth doing though is turning on adaptive sampling. This does seem to affect the viewport as well, and what it does is it just makes Blender vary the amount of samples that it gives to different areas in order to optimize the reduction in noise. So it doesn't necessarily do the full number of samples that you've set. It will do where it thinks it's particularly noisy, perhaps where there's a lot of dynamic range over a very small area, but where there isn't, it doesn't need to spend a lot of time doing that. So it optimizes the time. The next one is about light paths. By default, volumetric is 0 bounces. And really, to get the most out of volumetrics, you need more than that. So I'm going to put that up to 3. And that will actually add a bit of light to the scene, because we'll get now light bouncing off the volumetrics. And you can see it's slightly brighter in here now. And there's a bit more variation in the cloud. Bear in mind, this is still low samples right now. And for a scene without glass and water in, we really don't need caustics. They do add quite a bit of noise, so we'll turn those off. And that will optimize it a little as well. You should actually reduce the noise in the scene slightly. Noise being general noise, but also what we call fireflies, which is little bright dots in an otherwise dark area. So next, let's set how this scene works. We don't need to render alpha, so we can turn that off. We can render at 16-bit color depth. Generally, it's not necessary. And the defaults for post-processing with dither are generally fine. You might need to increase that if you have a very gradual graded, for example, sky, and you were getting banding. Increasing this dithering will often help with that. Under performance, I generally turn off automatic tile size, and I set it to 512 if you're using the GPU. If you're using the CPU, you should use a small size in order to use many of the cores as you've got. But I'm only using the GPU. I'm not even combining the two because I find that tends to be slower for me. And the optimal for that is typically blocks of 512 pixels. So let's give that a render and then we'll see where we're going. So that's rendered. Took about 3 minutes to render. Volumetrics does slow things down in cycles quite a bit. And that's not too bad from a noise standpoint. There is noise in the scene, obviously. If I zoom in here, you can see it there. But we can do a few things about that. So we'll change to the compositor up here, and we'll say use nodes. I didn't do too complex a compositor. But the first thing I'm going to do is just add under filter a denoise node. Now by default, just adding that node in, you can see it's compositing away. You can see it's smoothed it out already. And you could just do that and you've already got a very smooth looking image. If that's what you want, you can see the noise is just basically gone. Even if I rendered that at a higher resolution, this is 1080 resolution at the moment, you can't see it. You do lose a little bit of detail, but not very much. However, we can make that slightly better again, and we need to render in a slightly different way for that. So we come down to here under the scene options, and we can switch this on, which is denoising data. And you notice we get a whole load of new options here. This only works for cycles. You can use the denoise node for EV, but you don't get this denoising data currently. So we can take into there the normal and the albedo. So this is just extra information that helps the denoise node to work more effectively and to not lose data such as fine detail of geometry and so on. So we'll see what that comes out like in a moment. But first of all, we're just going to add something which adds a little bit of drama to the scene, makes it a little more interesting. And it's a common one to add, and it's a vignette. So we'll go to matte and we'll say ellipse mask. We'll set the width to 1 and the height to 0.5. We'll then add a filter which is a blur node. We'll set that to fast Gaussian. It's just a quicker filter, perhaps not as accurate, but this does add a bit of time, this filtering and so on, so we don't want to add too much to it. But at the end of the day, if it's a still image, you can take as long as you want really. Take the mask output and put that into the image. We'll select relative Y, so that tells it it's a wide image. We'll say 15%, it's my usual default for the blur amount, so it's a soft vignette rather than a hard one. And we'll say extend bounds, which stops any little strange artifacts at the edge of the image. And finally, we'll add color mix node into there. We'll set it to multiply, and then we'll take that image and put it into there. And after a moment's calculation, you can see we get a nice dark vignette. And I backed it off a little bit to 0.95, so it's not so that it is not quite as dark as that, a bit over the top. But if you look through the images of most cameras, you will see a certain amount of vignetting of anything. There's less light at the edges of the scene than in the middle. So we're about ready to give that another render and see how that looks. So there's the render with the smart denoising, and you can see that's really smooth and good looking. And if you want to, one last thing I did was I just added under color a gamma node. That'll depend on your lighting setup and so on, in order to just sort of darken the scene a little bit. So put it up a couple of clicks there. It has to redo the filters when you do that, but you can see the colors have become stronger and the overall scene is a little bit more interesting. So I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, let me know. I will share the original file that I created with my Patreon supporters. Otherwise, I will see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot. So I hope you found that interesting. If you did, let me know. If you enjoy these tutorials, don't forget to click like and subscribe. I also have a Facebook page and a Twitter account, and I now have a Patreon page as well. And I'll provide links to all of those in the description below. So I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot.